Chikank. You love to see it. You love to see it. Hello. Well, all right. Well, hello, and welcome back to Pencil to Pencil. Not Pencil I Pencil, Pencil T-O Pencil. Your weekly, 8 o'clockly, Wednesday-y live cast featuring 3 expert, real, pitch me, I must be dreaming, Steve Conley, expert cartoonists here to talk shop with you, dear viewer. I would love to do a round of introductions. I will be the first introduction. My name is JAMAR Nicholas, but a humble spice dealer. No, I better not say that. And mixed nerd company might get that wrong. You might get that wrong. I don't need any ops. In this world, I'm a cartoonist, and also in the traditional book space, they call me an author illustrator. Did I say my name? I'm JAMAR Nicholas. I almost forgot that part. I have a book series at Scholastic underneath the graphics imprint. Leon the Extraordinary is in stores now. In October 2024, this fall, the next book in the series, Leon Worst Friends Forever, will be on stands. Pick it up right now on pre-order, why don't you? Beyond other things, I'll pass the mic. Guys, I would be remiss if I did not introduce my co-host. You may know him in these streets as, come on, you guys got to do the belt motion. You know how to do it. Discount double check. He is the web. I messed it up. He is the world heavyweight champion of web comics. He is known as Stone Cold Steve Conley. What up, Steve Conley?
Featherweight.
Don't mess with your weight class. Did you cut weight, Steve? What's going on?
No, they're real heavyweights out there. I keep expecting Scott Kurtz to come off the top turnbuckle and get me in the head. Good to see you guys. I like that our introduction's like fresh. Every time it's like we really go live and we're like, what? Every time. I love it. My name is Steve Conley. I write and draw the webcomic The Middle Age. It is your 73rd favorite webcomic. You can find it at Webtoons. It's over on Go Comics, and it's on Tapas, and it's on my own website at middleagecomic.com. I also make TTRPG stuff like the currently kickstarting Nibblemancy. If you play D&D and you want to have a little cakey wizard, yeah, you can do that. That's at Nibblemancy. And I think I'd be remiss. That's the word? Remiss. If I didn't introduce the Tower of Power, the man of the hour, too sweet to be sour, the Kirby crackle to our snap and pop, Mr. Mike Manley.
Oh. Well, hello.
Hello.
Hey, Mike Manley.
Hey, everybody. I currently draw 2 syndicated comic strips, The Phantom and Judge Parker. And I've been told I've drawn your childhood. Many of you are rolling on the floor with deep, painful memories caused by my pencil mileage.
Oh, my goodness. That's fantastic. Mike, you know what? We talk about things in such kind of like blasé terms sometimes because we're pros, right? And pros kind of roll with other pros, right? So your contemporaries, your colleagues, your cohorts of sorts are other cartoonists, right? I almost liken it talking shop to other cartoonists like wizards all trying to impress each other at the wizard's parlor. Like, hey, look, have you seen this one? I pull this up my sleeve. Yeah. What else you got? Okay, I'm about to grab out the hat. Okay. Saw the lady hat? Yeah.
Saw the rabbit in half.
Well, yeah, there you go.
We nerd out over stuff like, what's the thread count of that cape? You know?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So, Mike, over the years that you've been in the business and kind of talking to all types of people, what has really kind of struck home to you about what we do and just kind of talking it over with other cartoonists? What's special about us?
Well,
Jamar in particular.
Yeah. I think the thing about cartoonists is you have to enjoy spending lots of alone time or a lot of time in your head, like in here, in your imagination. And especially anybody who does a syndicated cartoon. I mean, I just had a nice talk today with Tony DePaul. We were talking about that. Like, it's different. You know, people do comic strips. even more than comic books. When I do comic books, you get a break. But comic strips, you never get a break. There are no breaks, right? Because there's a new one every day. And if you do a more realistic strip, let's say, where there's the characters are more complex and you're drawing much more representational backgrounds, it's just a lot more man hours per strip. So it really takes a certain kind of personality to be able to sustain that. And almost nobody, even of all the thousands and thousands of people who wanted to do this, that's something that even people who are really good at doing it, but they may not be really good at doing it for like 60 weeks in a row, 52 weeks a year. You know, they might get to 30 and go like, oh man, I need a vacation. You know, it really is a certain kind of personality that kind of like, it's like a marathon, and you're like kind of get in your groove and you kind of go and you go. And that's very different from when I worked in comics, because when I would work on comics, even if I did monthly series, there was a break, maybe even a week when you didn't have anything. Maybe, you know, you were waiting for the script, or you could sort of start out slow, you know, depending upon the book. But I would get several. I never have a week off. The last time I had a week off was when I was literally in the hospital, right? And then even when I was in the hospital, part of the time when I was in the hospital, I was actually working on the strip on my, you know, doctor's scoring me up, and I'm drawing on my iPad as the blood is squirting.
You know, well, there's some feedback. I recall in this is what, back in the 80s, or maybe the late 80s, where Gary Trudeau was like, you know, I'm going to take a break.
Sabbatical?
For Dewsbury. And the whole, yeah, you know what? I think I need a month or so off. What? So you could just see how rigid things were. I mean, obviously back then, like there was no hiccups. You just did it, like, you know, all the time. You did not do it. And, you know, I remember that. And also when, you know, Watterson fought back against the syndicate about like how he wanted his stuff formatted. And there were all of a sudden just people like shaking things up. And I guess maybe that's a really early look into comic strips of starting to have, I don't know, self-care enact, or kind of where we are in the world now. It's like, well, you know, my mental health is paramount, not to the work. So I don't know. How do you feel about that, Mike?
Well, it's a very different world as far as I know. I mean, I've only been doing it going on 15 years, so I'm a baby, you know. I mean, there have been guys that have been doing it. I was watching a part of a interview with Cy Berry, you know, who started on the Phantom in '61, the year I was born. He did it until 99, I believe. So that was he did 30 something years he did it, you know. And he was saying it, you know, that was a 6-day-a-week job, right? So imagine having a job where, you know, you had 1 day off a week for 30 something years, you know. That's you know. And like if you wanted to go on a vacation, you really had to get far ahead, or you had to try to get somebody to help you out. I think Trudeau could probably say, I'm taking that off, because he was a big gorilla back then, you know. But I think most strip people wouldn't be able to say, well, I'm going away for 2 weeks, unless they had those 2 weeks in the can.
Right. That's a point that
you're not going to say, well, we're going to start rerunning, you know, Wizard of Id from, you know, 1967, right?
Right.
Why is Richard Nixon in Wizard of Id?
Hey, you know,
Jimmy Carter's president.
That's crazy. Well, the chat is starting to brighten up. And hello, chat. Welcome to Pencil to Pencil. We always like to prime the pump, as it were, with some interesting cartoonist chatter. And we'd love to hear from the chat about what we have going on tonight. All right, one question, and then we're going to bring our guests in because I don't want to eat up the clock here. Shout out to Corporal Ziggy USMC. See, I know what I'm doing. Corporal Ziggy says, "What was it? The old school work mindset to work? Was it intense, or like was it always that intense, or kind of like I guess maybe to decode what he's saying is like what is the work mindset to go into something like this versus now where people push back against being overworked?"
Well, I mean, just from my experience and the people that I knew that were older than me, especially the guys who grew up during the Depression.
Mm-hmm.
Look at any of the guys who grew up during the Depression, and their work ethic was superhuman compared to people now. Because, you know, if you made your money by page rate, the more pages you drew, the more money you made. And all those guys from like Kirby and I mean all the Golden Age and Silver Age greats, all those guys, Eisner, all those guys had just a superhuman work ethic compared, I think, to people now. There was no health day, there was no self-care, they, if you said that to those guys, they probably wouldn't even know what you were talking about. I mean, especially in comic books. I think even in strips, and the guys in the strips were millionaires. I mean, or close to being millionaires. Kniff and Raymond and Foster and all those guys made incredible livings off the strips. So if you had a fairly successful strip, you could make real big money. But in comics, you made nowhere near the amount of money that you made. Especially after World War II, the sales on comics really started going down. Like during World War II, they were selling millions. Like Superman was selling millions. Captain America was selling millions. Those guys are really making big money, and that's back when the Yankee dollar bought a lot. The Yankee dollar don't buy shit now. I think it buys like 30 cents, maybe if we're lucky. The dollar you earn today buys maybe 30%.
Well, you could buy a pair of dungarees for 25 cents back then, right?
You could buy a bag of sandwiches for a quarter. I mean, just all
Bag of sandwiches.
Bag of sandwiches. Yeah, there's a good book called Cartoon County, which was written by the son of John Cullen Murphy, who took over Prince Valiant after Hal Foster retired. It's a great book because it talks about that era where his father worked and all the cartoonists. Many of the cartoonists all lived within that one or two counties that were right outside of New York in like Connecticut, like Ridgefield, Connecticut, and places like that. A lot of illustrators lived there, sort of like a bedroom community to New York. And what he made I think I'm trying to remember, he was making, let's say he made $25,000. You can read in the book. That $25,000 when he started was the equivalent to making over $250 million a year. I mean, $250,000 a year now. So you made $5,000 in 1950. That was actually a lot of money. If you made $15,000 in 1950, that was a real big amount of money. So I remember Williamson, Williamson, who ties into our guest tonight, told me that I think he and his mother lived in a rent-controlled apartment in New York City that was something like $40, $45 a month. So in the 50s. So
month in the
50s, yeah. And like now that same apartment is probably like $4 or $5 grand now or something. I mean, it's crazy. What? So yeah, it's a whole different world. Work ethic is very different. It's really we can't compare it at all.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot more that we absorb as cartoonists, right? They used to give you paper. They used to have a bullpen that you could work in. There was a lot of stuff that the publishers provided that we do now. Like Al could take a pencil and indicate with a blue pencil on the original and send it in, and there would be somebody in King Features who would put the zipatone on, right? Or Ben-Day, as they would call it. Because there was zipatone, which had the glue already on it, and then there was Ben-Day that you put the rubber cement on, and then you stuck it on, right? So just all those little things are so different. Now we're like complete production facilities compared to how the old guys were.
That's very true. I was watching some tutorials from some young cartoonists who were like doing stuff with Clip Studio Paint. I was like, wait, you can do that? So there's a lot to be said to that. And I always like to make fun of you, Mike, not like I didn't have one too, of having a brand new minty facsimile machine in your studio for communication purposes.
That was a big step. That was a big step. That was a huge step. You had your own fax machine, right? You didn't have to go down to some place and have somebody fax it to you. When you had your own fax machine, and then after that didn't even last 10 years, right?
Yeah.
From the time I had my fax machine, I think in 88, 89, I got a fax machine. And by the time I moved here, I was 96. I was faxing stuff to Warner Brothers. And then within a year or two of that there was about 10 years of faxing, I think. And I still have some of them, and they're like curling and yellowing and sort of like,
oh yeah,
hey,
none of that stuff is good anymore. All right, guys, we're getting in the weeds. We're gonna be here all night. Let's talk about our guest tonight, because just talking about work ethic just kind of was a great prompt for tonight, because as handsome as we all are, none of us get to where we are without a lot of hard work, right? And I think that's one of the things in this kind of brotherhood and sisterhood that we share, is that everybody is a extremely hard worker. I don't know any lazy cartoonists. I mean, not in this generation. So that will bring us into introducing our guest for tonight. Dan SCKADE is here. And this was Mike's pick, and I've been learning all about Dan as we've been leading up to tonight. So Dan, why don't you do an intro? Mike, do an intro for us, and we'll bring Dan in.
Okay, well, I was interested to talk to Dan because he has taken over, or I guess revitalized Flash Gordon for King Features, and of course, Flash is one of the major adventure strips from last century, and is so influential on things that people don't even think about at all anymore. But there was 3 great adventure strips. There was Flash Gordon, Prince Valiant, and Terry and the Pirates. And so it was interesting. I wanted to talk to Dan because I thought he had a very interesting career and sort of a track record, where he's also worked on the Spirit, as well as his own Ringo Award-nominated Lavender Jack. And he's also part of a collective, a creator collective called Helioscope. So I was also interested to talk to him about that, because I was also talking to King Features right after I took over the Phantom about Flash Gordon, so we can talk about that too.
Fantastic. Well, I know everybody's in for a treat. Let me clear the decks and let's clear the nozzle and prepare for rendering. Let's bring in Dan SCHKADE. All right. Well, let me get my. Are you ready? Let's do it. Ping.
Hey guys.
Hey Dan. How are you?
Hey, Dan.
Glad you're still here.
Bad.
Awesome.
Oh, couldn't get rid of me.
So Dan, how do you feel about the talk about maybe like the heavy Sisyphusian rock that you carry as a cartoonist? Is it a heavy load?
I tell you what, listening to the show, waiting in the gorilla position, I was, we had a nice little conversation pre-show.
Yeah.
I had good energy going, and then I thought about how, oh yeah, no, it is an endless grind, isn't it? There really isn't a way out, is there? It's just this forever. Oh man.
Hello, darkness, my old friend.
Yeah.
But I mean, you're right. It is different now. You are your own shop. You are a one-man band to a degree, working the cymbals with your knees while you're blowing into a harmonica. But also we have tools we didn't used to have. You're talking about rubber cement. When I hear rubber cement, that's in the same category of phrases in my brain as like egg cream. Like it seems so ancient now. And by the way, I know artists today, like artists my age, who still use zip tone, who still use conventional, illustration techniques. But now with things like Clip Studio, with Photoshop, with Procreate, you can do stuff on your own that would have taken, it would have cost materials. You would have needed probably somebody else to do it for you, to do it in a timely fashion, that you can just do instantaneously today. So to a degree, there are ways in which it's easier now than it was in the 20th century. That said, the money is... I'm not buying fancy Alex Raymond cars with the money I'm making from doing Flash Gordon. I actually brought on an assistant, Emmett Graham, to help me with the current arc of Flash Gordon we're doing. He's doing some penciling assistance for me. And I would love to have arranged for him to have more money, but there sort of isn't money to be had. But also, it's good. I'm very happy with the living I'm making. My needs are supported, and I'm very lucky to have the job I do. It's just that constant push and pull that you're hearing over the course of this run-on paragraph of it's easier than it used to be, but also harder, but also it's better than it could be, but also I worry it's going to get worse. I'm sure these are the things Sisyphus is thinking about while he's doing his daily rep.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's really, I've been doing it long enough now that I can see very distinct epics in my career where you would think like, oh, wow, first there was a computer. When I had a computer, I think compared to some people, I wasn't at the top of the wave, but I knew other guys who were way back on the wave about getting a computer, and they're like, no. But then it eventually got to the point like, well, if you didn't have a computer, how were you going to get your script? How were you going to talk to people? It became an actual physical need in order to be able to do the job, right? Because the old strip guys would do a whole story and then take the whole, ship it in or take it in to the syndicate, right? And I send them week by week. I'm sure you probably do too. Like when you get a week, you send the week off. And so it's not like they're getting like, oh, you're getting the next complete story of an average story supposedly was around 13 weeks in the old days. I don't know if they're certainly not that way now, because Tony and I did a story on the Phantom that was almost 2.5 years.
Wow.
That's the last story, which was unheard of.
Right.
I don't think they would have actually let us do that in the old days. They would have wanted a story that was typically 13 weeks. And I remember reading that Frank Robbins, who was so fast, he had stories stacked up. Oh, you want another one? He would just, you know,
Wow.
he would ship it out. You know, I know with Al Williamson on Corrigan, he was right on the line sometimes, and they would fine you, which is something that people don't really know about. But they would fine you if you were late. So if you were late at 2 days, they probably okay. But if you were late more than that, they fined you. Like if I'm late on the Judge Parker Sunday, I think there's a late fee per day because the printer charges them a late fee because all the comic Sundays are printed way ahead of time, and then they print the other circular part, like the tire ads and the supermarket ad. Those are printed and then they're bundled and then they're sent. So you have to meet these like 8 week. I think you had to be 8 weeks ahead on the Sunday. And if you're late, the printer charges you, so then charges them, then they charge you.
I'm not early, so I'm familiar with this concept.
Oh, okay. But I mean, that's the kind of thing that no one really thinks about. The average person doesn't think about things like that.
I mean, the thing that really spins people's wigs when I'm just talking about my job to, people who aren't in comics or even people who are, that, the Sundays are on a completely different schedule from the weekdays. And not only that, but some papers only get the Sundays or they only get the dailies.
Yeah.
And some papers get the Sundays, but only the bottom 2 rows. And some papers get the Sundays, but only the bottom 2 rows and half of the top row. Like, so you have to, when you're doing a narrative strip like Flash Gordon, you have to write a story that works if read any of those ways. Either you're reading all 7 days or you're reading 66% of just the Sunday.
Right.
Which is a fun challenge. Like, don't get me wrong. I like the prompt. I think that's a pressure that lends to some really interesting storytelling solutions, but it's a lot more complicated than I assumed it would be when I first started trying out for the gig.
Yeah. And the thing is if you look at old strips, there was actually, I think I was looking at some Terry and the Pirates.
Which, by the way, great. I love Milton Caniff, a big Terry the Pirates fan.
Yeah, there were Sundays where you could see part of it was line and then part of it was inked, and I guess there was different formats and papers or widths. So, but yeah, that was something that I had to get used to, was the fact that on Judge Parker, they would drop the top tier. So nothing important could be written in that. Like, the killer is, and that was in the script of the panel that would get dropped. And also repeating information on Monday that was in a Sunday. So nothing devastating could be in a Sunday, because the person who read it on Saturday and whose paper didn't carry the Sunday would go like, well, wait a minute, what happened? Suddenly this person is dead. So there was all these things, like you said, that I learned right away. Like, wow, I never really thought about that.
Well, sort of a workaround that we came up with in an early meeting with me and editorial talking about what we were going to do with Flash. We landed on this idea that the dailies would be the main story. Like, that's really the core text, basically. And the Sundays are all summaries of the weekly episodes, but they're all told from a specific character's perspective. They're all told in first person. And they contain emotional information that might not have been present in the week. So they do serve as summaries. You can follow the story along just reading the Sundays, But if you've been reading the dailies, now you're also getting a level of, what is Dale's emotional investment in this current conflict. Some strips we've done from the perspective of like henchmen. We did a strip that was the like black box recording of a ship they crash in. And so we keep it, I think, pretty fresh that way. And we avoid the problem of having to apologize for the potential absence of the Sundays.
Right.
Which when I signed on, I thought it would just be one story all throughout. And there's ways in which that would be easier, because it's a little bit hard to work in two different parts of the story at the same time, especially since with the Sundays, you're summarizing events of strips you haven't drawn or in some case written yet. But it's also useful because in the Sundays, you commit to things that you then have to execute on in the week. And I'm sure that anybody in any kind of creative pursuit, whether or not it's professional, is painfully familiar with the feeling of option paralysis. I've got all these ideas. I've got oh man, which is the right way to go? What if I make a mistake? Like, well, we've reached into the future and pulled out what decisions you made. Now you have to work backwards from that.
Yeah. Well, why don't we kind of jump back to the, I guess, sort of your origin, and then we can jump into your origin on Flash, because we usually do this on we ask for everybody's origin story, because I have some interesting maybe information about my time talking to King Features about Flash Gordon. So why don't you tell us, like, did you go to college, and how did you get into this crazy business?
Well, I come from Austin, Texas. I was an only child, and we lived kind of out in the woods, in like a nice community. I'm not talking about tin roofs here, but there weren't a lot of other kids around. I spent a lot of time just on my own, like walking around the woods or reading, and comics became a real big fixation of mine. I loved not just how the stories worked, the immediacy of it, how unlike a novel, there's like an instant information download when you open a comic. But I also loved, with comic book series with ongoing properties, how vast the universe seemed. I would get my comics from half price books. So you're getting like a single issue that's part 2 of 4 of a Blue Beetle storyline. With it's the 90s. There isn't an easy way to access those other comics. You can't just go on Comixology. But I guess you can't go on Comixology either anymore. So you're trying to extrapolate out what story there was outside of these single issues you got. There are characters that I thought were huge deals. Like I remember I thought that Conduit, the Superman villain, I thought he was like Superman's Two-Face. I thought he was hugest deal because I only had a comic with Conduit in it. And like I doubt 20% of the people watching this can even tell me who Conduit is. But that's what's great about these stories, is the way they're atomized, the way they kind of not just are separate from each other, but also have a shared connection to each other. That was so charismatic to me.
You mentioned Conduit, and Blue Beetle. Was DC Comics where you got your taste for comics?
It was kind of all over the map, honestly, because like every kid, like, how like in video games you start with like one character that you then can modify and adapt. Every kid starts liking Spider-Man and Batman, and so I liked Marvel stuff because with Spider-Man meets every superhero, so you meet every superhero reading Spider-Man comics. I got really into Doctor Strange. I really liked Daredevil. With the DC stuff, I was really drawn into some of the relatively more obscure characters like Dr. Fate and The Question. So those were my Cape comic starting grounds, and then from there, like I got really into the Tick. I loved I loved like Milk and Cheese, and I'm starting to blank because we're now getting in the territory of guys I now know, and I'm trying like, oh wait, I don't want to. I don't want to leave Shannon Wheeler out.
Right. Dan,
but
did you get into Scud the Disposable Assassin?
Too late to say I was a real fan.
Okay.
And were you drawing at that time too? Were you like reading comics and then drawing comics? Like, when did that point happen? Because there's usually always a point where like you read comics, but then there's that point where you start drawing the characters.
I was always drawing. Art was my main thing. I was one of those smart kids that was a bad student, and but the thing that I was passionate about, one of the things I was passionate about was drawing, but not necessarily getting better at drawing so much as drawing things that were in my head. So I would draw superheroes, characters from TV, whatever, but I also started making my own characters fairly early on. Like in my grandparents' house, the last time that I was there, maybe 15 years ago or so, I saw they had a laminated one-page comic I did when I was 6 about a character called Metal Man.
That's
unrelated to Doc Magnus.
All right.
And then I found this notebook of blue-lined paper comics I did when I was 10 and 11 or so about. I actually have a half-finished comic that like relates the story of these characters, because it was like Gadget Man and Captain Democracy and like this like ersatz Justice League of characters who like. It got very 100 Years of Solitude. Like they all had kids that then also became characters, and the kids married each other.
Wow.
So, these sprawling comic book universes that were popping up while I was walking around the woods in Austin. Now, in terms of drawing comics, we're talking short stories, right?
Yeah.
When I was in my late high school years, 17, I think, I made my first 24-page inked, lettered, whole thing comic, and I didn't really know what to do with it. But by coincidence, the year before at a blood drive, they had local artists. I was living in San Diego at the time. They had local San Diego artists showing up at this blood bank to draw sketches of people. That was like a promotion they had, and one of the people they had there was Batten Lash, who, rest in peace, Batten Lash. And who I like immediately like kind of imprinted on, because he was so cool and like charming and self-effacing. He had this Jeff Goldblum thing going on, and so I emailed him. My dad's suggestion. I emailed him, explained that I had a comic book, and he invited me to his studio on this second story studio in downtown San Diego. These tall glass transoms, a bunch of monster movie memorabilia, a sketch by Will Eisner on the wall. And I was just like, oh, I gotta be this guy. This is and it's not like I imprinted on, John Romita Jr. or something. Like he was, I don't think anybody would mind me saying that he wasn't the biggest deal in comics, right? But he was just that guy. He was the indie comic guy, and I was just like, I don't yet know like who I want to be, but I know that this is the kind of guy I want to be. And that was it. That was after that, it was like, I'm going to get into comics. It's the hole that was meant for me. So
you had the impulse, you were creating, and then you met a person who actually did it, and then it made the thing real. It's like, here's a real person who really does this. So it's not just like a fantasy kind of a thing.
Oh yeah. Well, I'm sure we can all relate to like the first time you met a real cartoonist, like a real comic book artist. I mean, it was like meeting an alien. It was like this cool like thing that's real you could talk to, and they're wearing Skechers. Like this person, this thing is now tangible. In fact, it's so interesting talking about my experiences. One of my best friends in comics is Brendan Wagner, who we worked together on Spirit. We're doing a comic St. John right now at Dark Horse. I was in his wedding. Like Brendan and I are real close, but his father is Matt Wagner, and so from like age 0, he was around some of the biggest names in the business, and so to him these are all just guys.
Yeah.
But to me, they were the guys.
Right.
Yeah. I think that can't be understated. Just, having access to people that kind of make it real. The optics of what we do is, I guess maybe it's because the world is a lot smaller now. It seems, oh, well, of course I've met a cartoonist somewhere. But like it was just really alien, kind of what Dan was saying, to even know somebody in your town that may have done it. Or maybe it was an old guy who used to do it. There are a lot of Eustas in Philly. You know what I mean? Like you'd run into them on the subway. Man, I used to draw. Check this out. But like nobody was like really doing it.
Well, it also depends upon where you lived, right?
That's
like,
a big one.
If you lived in San Diego, you're in proximity to a lot of cartoonists because you're also in close proximity to Los Angeles. Like if you lived in New Jersey, you're in proximity to New York. It's really easy to bump into a cartoonist if you were interested. But when I grew up in Michigan, there were no cartoonists, although a lot of cartoonists came from Detroit. My first convention was a show in, I believe it was Farmington. And in that show, there was Mike Vosberg, I believe, or Al Milgram, and Walt Simonson. And I want to say Terry Austin.
Ooh.
But it was it was like the first convention I went to. And I remember really connecting with Walt. And if anybody knows Walt is very conversational. That one, so you would get like maybe 1 or 2 shows a year that maybe you could go to. And so you went, even if the person at the show was not a person you were in love with their work, it was like an opportunity to meet a cartoonist. So, so what did he have you do with your comic? Did he help you print it? Did he tell you how to go about turning it into an actual book?
He did. When I reached out to him, it was at the end of the school year. So we're talking like a month or 2 before San Diego Comic-Con, and which at that time we're talking 2007, I guess. So you could still like buy tickets the same day to go to San Diego. And so he showed me how to make an ash can. And because and this was such useful advice early on. And if you know Batten, which it sounds like you guys did, he was like the sweetest man in the world. And in that way, he informed me like, you're not good yet. Like it's not because you aren't good. It doesn't mean you're untalented. It means you're 17. And so you shouldn't be treating this like it's your masterpiece. Make a bunch of literally disposable comics. That's why they call them ash cans, and just go around and meet other artists. Give it to them, because by handing them an ash can, you're proving to them that you can complete something. But you're also being humble enough to be like, this is my beginning. So for years, I did that. I went to conventions with ash cans and I just handed them to artists. I remember I met Tony DeZuniga in probably 2009, and I'm sorry if I'm saying his name wrong, but legendary inker, co-creator of Jonah Hex, like amazing guy. And he, in the margins of my ash cans, because of course, we're getting them from Kinko, so there's these fat, ugly margins. And he starts laying out how I should have laid out the page in the margins.
Wow.
Oh, it was so cool.
It's beautiful.
Anyway, so Batten encouraged me to do that. That first Comic-Con, he was like, all right, so what you're going to do is you're going to come to my booth and I'm going to introduce you to some people. And he
pretty spot on. It's pretty
thank you. That's what he did. He took me around. He had me stick around after the Eisner Awards, and he actually introduced me to Neil Gaiman, which was very huge for me. Obviously, I met Paul Pope. I was a huge Paul Pope fan, and for years, Batten did that. When I would show up to shows, he would have you met Dave Gibbons? Like, just the coolest guy in the world. And his, obviously his wife Jackie was also super lovely. It's funny. I also have ended up with a curly blonde haired woman with dark rimmed glasses named Jackie. So I'm always getting closer to Batten. But yeah, he showed me how to approach this both professionally, but also with humility. And I think that was the most useful thing I could have possibly had, because he took me seriously. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure that he knew, because even now at this point in my career, I know that you kind of have to treat people seriously, because if they can't capitalize on that, if they fold when you treat them seriously, or they don't understand what you're saying, or they take it the wrong way, then either they don't really have what it takes right now to make it in this business, or they're just not going to respond to the way you do it. And so you have to treat people kind of on the level like that, treat them like adults, either for their own good or for yours. So you're not wasting time on somebody who just isn't going to end up speaking your language.
Yeah. What was that 24-page comic about?
It was called The Private Files of the Fowl. It was this sort of a pulpy vigilante type character called the Fowl, who was a paranoid schizophrenic who was in treatment. He lived with like a nurse practitioner who kept him medicated, and being the Fowl, being this avian themed, gun-toting vigilante, was essentially part of his therapy. And it was kind of a vaguely a Tick style thing where there were these kind of Tim Burton-y versions of other characters. But it didn't quite fall into the Invincible territory where you're doing one-to-one representations. It's more like, we had a character called the Half Ghost, who was a character who had been ectoplasmically reconstituted from the dead, with any of his missing parts replaced with ghost parts. So just the kind of offbeat things like that.
Love it.
And I did, I think, 5 issues of that over the course of my, early 20s, and making ash cans, going to local shops. Sure. They carried them on the indie chicken wire rack that every shop has. Mm-hmm. I kept doing the Fowl for a couple of years. Then I did this comic, San Hannibal, which was sort of a punk neon private eye comic. That gave me the bona fides to start getting some work at doing some stories for Dark Horse. It also introduced me to Brennan Wagner. And some of the Fowl stuff I'd done and the San Hannibal stuff got me the chance to try out for the Spirit. And then everything kind of built from there.
That's great.
Right.
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Dan.
No, please.
Well, I had a question about the Tick, and even Batten to a small degree. What I loved about Ben Edlund's stuff, in just that moment in time where it was almost like, to me, and I could be wrong, it was like the birth of randomness. You know what I mean? It was kind of like, hey, let's take this and then do this and then turn it and give it back to you. And it kind of unlocked a lot of people's sense of humor. Like, people really connected with that kind of stuff. And I wonder if, besides just, you know, the art style or maybe the storytelling, did that Ben's stuff kind of connect with you in maybe in a humorous way, or how you approach humor?
Oh, certainly. Because the thing about the Tick, and his sense of humor in general, because I just like Ben Edlund as a writer. I like his TV writing. But what he had, and what Batten had, what a lot of artists, like kind of funny comic book people like that have, is the absurdity is a way into character. Like, I'm also a big fan of Dan Harmon, you know, Community, Rick and Morty. And I think that going broad with ridiculous concepts, it creates this emotional slack that you can capitalize on to get at things that would be a little bit too serious if you were playing it totally straight, or just would be a bummer if you're playing it totally straight. Like, if I have to watch a show about a self-destructive, depressed actor, I'd rather it be Will Arnett voicing a horse than just Will Arnett. So I definitely was attracted to that. But I never quite fell into the, and this is a comic I read and enjoyed, I didn't quite fall into the Dr. McNinja area where it was just Mad Lib comics.
Right.
I kind of think of it, and this is a little bit self congratulatory, I guess, but I always kind of favored the more David Lynch style thing, where it was disparate influences that feel weird together. Why is a cowboy a ghost, right? Why all of a sudden is there a horse here? But it was a friction that created a sense of unease, rather than, isn't it funny that God is also a stoner? Now, having said that, almost my entire Instagram presence is just, what if Saul Goodman defended Magneto? Like, it's just these one-off gag strips that I do super quickly because I want to feel a sense of accomplishment that only takes 2 hours. And that's the stuff that gets really popular online. It's very accessible. I like that. I like that people dig it. So I definitely do have an appreciation for thing meets thing comedy. It's just that in my serious work, I like to think that a greater, I hate how this sounds. I like to think that a greater truth can be reached through that absurdity.
No, that tracks.
Yeah.
Before we dip into some more conversation, we have a bunch of questions starting to stack, Dan.
Okay.
So I hope maybe we could kind of pull into this a little bit.
Hit me.
I usually push this over to Steve, but I brought this up. So,
but I do want to say that I think Batten did the same thing for me a few years earlier. But yeah.
Really?
Yeah. Charming, lovely person.
Well, that's so wonderful.
So, all right. So here's something, and then I'll turn this over to Steve later. So our good new friend, Corporal Ziggy, USMC, says, I love your art style. I can't explain it, but maybe a modernized 1960s, you can get a sense of H.P. Lovecraft, Call of Cthulhu, and Lavender Jack too. So the style question always comes up, and I wonder, like, how do you kind of translate your art style, or do you even think about it at all?
I mean, really hit the nail on the head. I'm a huge fan of 20th century cartooning in general. A huge number of my influences come from before 1970. And that's an intentional aesthetic that I chase. Like, I'm able to draw in other ways. We did, for the Flash Gordon 90th anniversary, we did a week where every day was in a different style. And some people remarked that it was interesting that I could draw other ways, but chose not to. And it's because that graphic illustratorly style really appeals to me. I feel like it just like we were talking about how absurdity creates an emotional space. I feel like this more cartoony Harvey Kurtzman, Steve Ditko style of rendering, it does create a space that I think the audience can inhabit more, both to create comedy, but also to create, fear, drama, tension, sadness, and also happiness. Like I feel like there's something about that cartooning that's so gleeful. Now, you're talking about H.P. Lovecraft. Anything that can be used to create glee, to create that lightness, can be used to create horror. Like I think Al Columbia is an example of like the best in the world at doing this, taking this merry melody aesthetic and taking it to a super, super dark place. And so I like an aesthetic that can do both without ever kind of betraying itself. And to find a look like that, stuff in the middle of the century, stuff from the underground comics movement, got a lot of mileage out of that. Art Spiegelman, Dennis Kitchen, and anyway, so Trina Robbins. So you've completely picked up on what I'm going for, which is very nice. Very nice to hear.
Awesome. Thanks, Corporal Ziggy. Oh, I thought I got rid of that. All right.
Do you have another question? Or I was going to ask about, so we mentioned Lavender Jack. What was so that was for folks who, I think it's still able to be read on Webtoons, isn't it?
That's right.
Yeah. So it was a Webtoons original series. What got you from the print books over into the website?
Let's see. Now you do Webtoon as well, is that right?
On the Canvas side. I'm not one of their exclusives. I'm more of a hunter gatherer than.
Oh, you're one of the people that actually makes the platform usable. Okay, I got you. Yeah, I was done with the Spirit. I was doing just little pickup jobs, and at the end of the Spirit, I'd come up with this concept for Lavender Jack to take a like highfalutin, high society P.G. Wodehouse style story and combine it with a, urban action adventure masked man story. And I'd pitch it to a couple places, and it would get pretty far, but not quite get the green light. I think because it was just a little too esoteric. But then a friend of mine, Becca Caden, became an editor at Webtoon, and I believe she had seen the Lavender Jack pitch when she was working at Dark Horse, and she reached out to me and said, "Hey, we're looking for like a very American style comic book series, like a serious drama, and that also wasn't just like something that had a more specific atmosphere to it that their readers might connect to more." And so I reformatted Lavender Jack from a 4-issue miniseries into an ongoing webtoon, and it somehow it got through. And I'm not being self-effacing. It was apparently kind of a tough sell, because Lavender Jack it's an action story, and it's like an upper class mystery with a murder element. It's also an alternate history. It's in this like very like this queer non-white space that a lot of stuff in this genre doesn't tend to go with. One of our characters, one of our principal characters, is a 6 foot tall 60-year-old Black woman that just like, there's just there isn't a market for this, but they believed in it enough to put it on. Becca really went to bat for it, and then we ended up doing 3 seasons of it. It got nominated for an Eisner and a Ringo, and it kept me employed throughout COVID. So really, yeah, whenever you get like a wild notion, I'm speaking to the audience, you guys all know this, but whenever you get a wild notion of like, oh, it's a comic about an opera singer on a spaceship, writing it down, doing some sketches, and having like a kind of basic pitch for it it's never wasted time, because you never know when in 3 years someone's going to ask you for specifically that, and now you have a job for 4 years. This whole business is just people who had the wherewithal to write down ideas.
And there's a certain presumption that webtoons had to had to look like manga. You know, there's a kind of a sense like, and I love that specifically things like Lavender Jack, and we saw Tom Zoller in here a little while ago. Love and Kate. Oh no, sorry, I got it wrong. Cupid's Arrow. Things like that didn't fit that mold. The folks that Tom Akel brought in as well.
Yeah, Tom was great. And it's, Lavender Jack was never a monster on Webtoon. Like it never did like really big numbers, but the audience was super engaged. It was something like our engagement ratio was like 30% or something. Like it was very, the readership that we garnered was so intelligent and funny. They, the mysteries in Lavender Jack over the 3 seasons were all, I put a lot of work into them. I think they were pretty well constructed. And there were people in the comments who were solving the mystery, who actually predicted the appearance of a character that hadn't shown up yet, because they were just that plugged into it. And that was, that was the coolest thing in the world. Honestly, I don't know if we would have had that audience if it was bigger. I think that the audience forming a smaller kind of cult community,
right?
Like Lavender Jack was the Twin Peaks of Webtoon, and I'm very, there's stuff I would do differently. Of course, it was my first time helming a series of that scope by myself, but I'm still really proud of it, and more than anything, I'm really proud of the wonderful collection of people that came out to support it. Sorry, I haven't thought about that in a minute, so I'm getting a little emotional.
Dan, I have another Lavender Jack question from Gordon Graham from YouTube. What up, Gordon?
Oh, hey.
It says, I never would have guessed Lavender Jack was reformatted from a standard book. It's so strikingly of the scrolling form. What went into that alteration process?
Well, thankfully, by the time I pitched it, none of the art was done yet. Like I just had character sketches and a pretty extensive story document. In fact, those character sketches were colored by Brendan Wagner. So
it all comes around.
It does. Everybody in comics knows everybody, but basically only knows 5 people. So the main thing with that was, like I say, I pitched it as issues originally. It was just a matter of deconstructing that story into weekly episodes, each of which is essentially 7 pages of content. And working with Becca, who at that point had already picked up a really solid understanding of how Webtoon worked as a format, I slowly got the handle of how much information every episode could contain, how to build and maintain a tension that lasted weeks while making each episode still satisfying. So it was a lot of that. And then the more we adapted it to Webtoon, the more the story changed to accommodate the freedom that we now had. And of course, I'm only saying this because I don't know if I'm going to have an opportunity to say it later. Lavender Jack also benefited from its colorist, Jen Manley Lee, who we had from day one, who worked on every single episode. And Jen, who I became aware of through my studio community and who has done this amazing comic Dicebox for years and years, was able to bring a more well thought out color dimension to it that freed me up to kind of get my arms around the story and artistic format side of it. And then, of course, our editor, Bree Boswell, who took over after Becca, was also indispensable in that. So I got a bad habit of only talking about myself when I talk about Lavender Jack. I want to make sure that the other people who literally made it possible get in the conversation.
Yeah, I think that's one thing that a lot of people don't realize is that with something like webtoons, because you're having to produce such a volume of material quickly, that many of those things are team efforts. They have a whole team of people that work on it, which is very much the manga format.
Yes.
Where these, the head guy, but then he might lay it out and only do the principal characters, and then they've got somebody who does or 2 or 3 people that do backgrounds, and people that do zipatone and lettering. I mean, there's a whole. It's much more like what the comic books were like in the 40s here, where you had a whole team.
Yeah,
that's the way they still work in Japan. So
it's pretty incredible.
Yeah.
When did you get involved with the studio?
So Helioscope, which was called Periscope at the time, is a studio in Portland. As I'm sure you guys know, I'm saying for the audience, a studio in Portland's been around since the mid 2000s, which has something like, I'd moved to Portland. I was living in Portland at the time. I moved there specifically to get into comics because Portland is such a big comic book town. Periscope is a collective of comic book artists of a lot of different disciplines, like Steve Lieber, Ron Chan, Erica Moen, Colleen Coover, Paul Guinan, like you're Jeff Parker. You're talking about a very wide range of talents, interests. Our youngest member when I joined was 24, and our oldest was Ron Randall, who I believe was 60. Steve invited me to visit when I started doing the Spirit, and within the year I'd become a member. And that studio experience, man, I can't even imagine what my career would be like without that. I mean, not just to be around that much talent and collective experience, but also just seeing other artists live their lives, knowing that the things I was feeling, fearing, stressing out over weren't unique to me. Mm-hmm. Watching other people's careers wax, wane, swell, being able to be invested in a true community. I mean, that place. Also, one time I was between apartments and I spent a week on the couch in the studio. Nobody knows that. Helioscope. That I credit. Like honestly, there's 3 things that I kind of credit my career to outside of my own work ethic and tremendous talent. It's Bat and Lash, it's Brennan Wagner, and it's Helioscope. So I definitely feel a lot of gratitude to my time at that studio.
Well, Dan, what I find interesting about that is, see, it comes back around to that community thing, and you coming from where you came from, and maybe even like dreaming, oh, wow, there are people that do this for real, and then shunting to the future where now you're in a studio full of cartoonists. It goes back to the whole Wizards Guild again. Right now you're in it and you're breathing in it, and it's probably, it can't get more real than that. Like that has to just give you such a huge boost to your own creativity, or even to make yourself feel like you're doing a real thing.
It's true. And sadly, I'm no longer physically in the studio. And working on your own has its own benefits. You don't have to be self-conscious about what YouTube videos you're watching. But
music or whatever, right?
Yeah.
Clear your browser.
Yes. But yeah, the idea of this thing feeling like it's real, because it's all. Thank you. I asked Jackie for some water, and she has these cute like little cups she got from a recent visit to Japan.
Oh, very, very
That's
cool.
What she's
very
kawaii.
Yeah.
Right. So being able to actually put a face, put a like a proof of the thing you want to do in front of you is a big part of what makes it possible. In the same way they say, like, the first person to beat the whatever minute mile, like they were the first person in history to do it, and then 3 other people did it the next year because they knew it was possible.
Mm-hmm. That's just like beating Mike Tyson in Punch Out. Like nobody at school believed it until, well, anyway, that's another session. But you know, so Mike, do you want to maybe talk a little bit more about Flash, and then we have some Flash questions?
Yeah. Well, I think it's very interesting that you're doing Flash, because, like I said, when I started on the Phantom, not too long after that, I was talking to King about Flash Gordon, because this is before they started doing the guest thing with people doing strips every Sunday. There for a while, they'd have a different writer artist do strips.
Oh yeah.
They had this property, and then they're trying to figure out, like, well, what are we going to do with it? Because we have the classic version, and then we have this 70s movie, which probably more, people of a certain age would know. And I was talking to them about like, well, they were thinking of, like I said, this was before they started doing that. And I said, well, you could do like what DC did, where you would do a style guide, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which you could have all these poses of the characters. But then what you really have to decide is, do you want classic Flash Gordon, or do you want some modern version of Flash Gordon? Because are you trying to get teenage boys who are looking at webtoons, is a different audience than people who will spend $45, $50, $60 on a really nice hardback reprint of the classic strips. And I think you sort of have to decide which way you want to go with the character, right? Mm-hmm. Because and they weren't really sure of what they wanted to do. They knew that it had this property. They knew that it had some value. I think they were thinking of relaunching it in some way, but they weren't really sure of which direction they wanted to go. And part of it also, I think, is that the people at King, the person I was talking to was fairly young. So, they probably don't really know the lore of Flash Gordon, what makes Flash Gordon special or unique. They don't know the history of the strip. And so I was like, my thing to them was like, you have to sort of decide capes or no capes, right? Right. And like I said, like Ming the Merciless, all right, he was the Yellow Peril, which all the old pulp characters were, right? That was very standard pulp thing. The Orient was mysterious. A lot of the characters were, the bad guys were ethnic. They were Fu Manchu, right? Now, that would probably not play today in today's world to make him, the slant-eyed, bad caricature of a bad guy. So you also have to decide, well, how do you want to depict Ming? Is it going to just be a bald guy like Lex Luthor, which might be kind of boring, but you can't do something that's racist? And I said, we deal with that with the Phantom because a lot of his characters, like Garan, the guy with the little plant hat, you have to handle them in a certain way because they're classic characters, but you also don't want to make them to appear to be derogatory or racist. And so it's like a fine line with some characters, right? Like these characters are pygmies. So I find it, so I had this conversation and it really, we went back and forth for a little while. And then the next thing, they started doing the guest Sundays.
The flash forwards from about 3 years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So is that when you became aware of it, or is that, how did you become aware of it? And I think what you're doing is you're doing some of the things in the strip that I talked to them about, which is you've got to, how much classic, how much new. I think the way you're depicting it is modern, even though he's wearing a sort of the classic flat with the three, whatever that weird doohickey t-shirt with the three. I don't know what they were, what they were, but I think you're sort of like splitting it right down the middle in a way, which I found really cool and really interesting, because I think it's really hard to do some of those characters and not violate the core of what they were, which is what they do often when they do the Phantom. Because when modern comics is the Phantom, they turn him into Batman. And
Right.
He's not Batman. Right? He's not this angry, avenging person. But usually when they do them, he's always this grim, and he's not grim.
He's a lot closer to like Andy Griffith than Batman.
Yeah. So I'm interested in how you became involved and what your evolution was. Like, how did you pitch that?
So my first involvement with Flash Gordon professionally was I did one of those flash forward strips, as you said. T reached out to me, and the version I did for that was very informed by the Buster Crabs serials, which was really my introduction to Flash Gordon. I was aware of it. I'm kind of I flatter myself as a student of comic book history, so I was aware of Alex Raymond and the incredible importance of Flash Gordon. I knew about its influence. I knew that it's where we get so much of Superman. It's where we get the Hawkmen. It's where we get a character called the Flash is like just wearing a Flash Gordon shirt. So I was aware of it academically, but I didn't really get the electricity of it until I saw my friend group here. We're talking like about 20 men and women would do these backyard movie nights in the summer, and while people were like getting the hot dogs and finding their seats, the host would project on the side of the house the Buster Crabs serials. And so we would watch one of those every week in a group setting, and in a way that kind of replicates what it would have been like to see them originally. And I was just like, oh, this is so much more exciting than I'd like been led to believe, basically. People, I think, if you ask your average comic book fan, before I hit the scene and changed everything, to talk about Flash Gordon, I think they would use words like cheesy. I think they would, like, in their head, it's a very hokey, stiff thing. But man, watching Buster Crab up on that screen, like shirt torn, like panting, running around, he's like throttling guards to get them away from Dale. Dale herself is like the way she's like braced against walls, like trying not to get hit by a spear. Painting a bear in stripes to make it a monster. It's like there's something almost grindhousey about it. Anyway, so when I was watching those real early on, right when Flash first gets to Mongo and meets Ming the Merciless, Ming throws him in this gladiatorial pit, and doors slide open on the outer rims of the pit, and from the dark tunnels behind come these hairy ogre dudes who are just like wrestlers in like fake fangs, and one of them isn't even wearing the fangs. But I saw those and I was like, what's their day like? Like what's the day leading up to like coming out of the pit like? So my flash forward comic was about one of those guys. I picked this race of the planet that isn't depicted very often. They're called the Dragon Men. They all look like Goliath from Gargoyles, and I picked one of them, and I did a strip about one of them fighting Flash in the gladiatorial pit, and him kind of the Dragon Man coming to an understanding that like God, what's the point of this? Like, I'm working so hard for an emperor that doesn't care if I live or die. Like even the like long lost king of my planet like wants Flash to kill me so that he can survive. And just like the depression of that. And then right before Flash is gonna like knock him into next week with this big mace, Flash is just like, hey, I'm sorry about this. And so as the Dragon Man is being like knocked back, like one of his horns pops off as he's being knocked back into space, he was like, I kind of needed to hear that just then. So a year or two later, I was wrapping up. Yeah, no, that's how it always gets with me. A year or two later, I was wrapping up Lavender Jack, and I reached out to T again to say, hey, I've been doing a weekly comic. I bet I could probably adapt those skills into doing a daily strip. If something opens up, let me know. I think my specific thing that I said in the email was, let me know if you need somebody to show Rip Kirby how to use a smartphone. And then a month or so later, they said they had something to try out for, and it turns out it was Flash. So I went back to that strip I did because I just really liked that angle on the character, that in kind of a hopeless world, here's a purely decent guy. And so they sent me a bunch of PDFs of the original Alex Raymond years. I read through all of those, and right away I thought, we're going to go classic with it. We're going to do basically what Batman the Animated Series did, and we're going to do a modern, stylish version of the classic concept. We're not going to reinvent the wheel. We're not going to drastically change any of the like building blocks of the series. We're just going to streamline some of them. Like for instance, in the original canon, Flash wins this big tournament on Mongo because Ming legally isn't allowed to kill him, and it means that Flash gets to be king of an underground kingdom. We kind of take that stuff out. Let's get the thorny, weird parts of the lore, and kind of anything that makes it kind of hard to understand, just pull that out, but leave the big iconic stuff. You know, the Earth under attack, they land on Mongo, they meet Ming, they form alliances, and they overthrow Ming. That's the Flash Gordon story. And so I then thought, okay, well, what if we assume all of that already happened and then start from Ming being deposed? And so now, like I say, my idea was, in a hopeless, kind of dangerous world, here's a purely good guy. Well, once we've overthrown the evil emperor, there's no more absolute evil for everyone to unite against.
Right.
Jealousies start to take a hold. Politics starts to get thorny. People who were allies in war realize they still have differences. And so into that much murkier world, let's drop Flash along with Dale Arden and Dr. Zarkov, who are also heroic, but neither of them are as brave or as unambiguously good as Flash is. And like with that trio, let's triangulate a perspective on some complex moral situations in a way that will be fun to read every day. So that was my approach. It was classic vehicle, smoothed out, like All-Star Superman style approach to the continuity that we then take in interesting new directions where we meet characters who are familiar to us, but also characters that aren't kings and queens and princesses, characters that are like I took a version of that Dragon Man character from my strip, you know, a new version. There's stuff about him that's different, and I I put him in the main cast. He is part of the team with the three humans. We meet some Imperial airmen who deserted the war. You know, we meet scavengers and security guards, and we meet just like the little people who are caught up in the swell of history. And all of that said much more concisely was my pitch.
Ah, that's great. And the thing is that people don't really realize that there would have been no Star Wars if there wasn't Flash Gordon. In fact, Lucas wanted to do Flash Gordon, but he couldn't get the rights, which is why we got Star Wars.
Yeah, which is a funny thing when doing the comic, because you're always you're kind of in conversation with Star Wars. You can't help but be.
Yeah.
And the key is to not steer too hard into that. It's going to be there no matter what. And so if you make like an oblique Star Wars reference, it'll just come off as thirsty, honestly.
Right.
Because like you don't have to make Star Wars references, because like in my next arc, am I supposed to say this? I don't know. Well, at some point in the series, they're going to go to Sky City, which is just Cloud City.
Right.
There's no need. Flash fights the evil Emperor. Like it's all just there in the text.
Right.
So we don't. We try not to be shackled by that, but rather use that as a useful shorthand so that people's knowledge of Star Wars actually helps them understand Flash Gordon, instead of being kind of contrary against it.
Yeah. I mean, the bones of Star Wars are Flash Gordon.
It's true.
Right? I mean, Lucas took his favorite parts of all that stuff, and made Star Wars out of it. I mean, he knew exactly what to do and how to blend it. But if you're not familiar with that material, like we are, it might seem like, well, wait a minute, that's kind of like Star Wars, But I mean, it's that way with when you start dealing with any of these sort of iconic characters, because Flash is very iconic character.
Absolutely.
And I think that's one of the reasons why, besides Alex Raymond's genius as an artist, I mean, it was so influential on every artist from the time it was created. I mean, people were copying figures, and I mean, it's such a root for comics that many younger people working today in the business are sort of like, we're using the language that those guys invented when they did adventure strips in the first 10 years. Nobody had drawn figures like that. Nobody had drawn continuity like that until they started doing comic strips. I mean, they were even taking from that stuff in the beginning with film. So
yeah. And those comic strips were in every living room in America. Every comic book artist, because like Superman comes out in 1938, right? And Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster were in their early 20s when that came out, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
When Will Eisner did The Spirit in 1940, he was only 23. So those guys, by that point, Flash Gordon had been out for, it came out in 1934. So it had been out between 4 and 6 years, depending on who we're talking about. So during their like late teenage years, really when you get serious about art, they're reading Flash Gordon every single week. And you have a whole generation of comic book artists creating what we think of as comics today, creating the superhero and creating all these other like adventure comics as well. They're all pulling from those Sunday funnies, and they're all pulling from Flash Gordon.
Yep. I mean, from Jack Kirby to anybody who was alive and grew up in the 30s, or Frazetta, those guys who grew up born in 28. I mean, that was what they were eating every day, every Sunday, and it's when I would teach, sometimes I would show stuff like that, and I would try to tell the students, it's hard for us to imagine, because we're TV people. We grew up on TV, we grew up on movies, but all that money that's spent on TV was spent on print, right? So like radio and print was huge, and everybody read those strips, and everybody listened to the Shadow, everybody listened to, Fibber McGee or whatever those radio, like the entire nation listened to those or read those strips. And adults bought those newspapers. Kids didn't buy the newspapers. So adults were reading it too. And so it's hard for us to imagine like the millions of dollars that people spend on TV. Not all that money was going into other areas, other movies or print or radio.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So
this might be a very good point for us to go into, because we're on overtime already, you guys.
Look at that.
I like to say this every time. Where did time go? But Dan, I hope you're hydrated, because we're about to enter the lightning round.
Can I squeeze in just a quick question with this? Cut the line a little bit here.
Sure, Steve.
You get to see it in your local paper.
I have yet to see Flash Gordon in person. I'm halfway through. I've done 200 strips. I've yet to see it in person.
Right.
People send me cell phone pictures of it in their paper, and that's great. My mom even bought one of the strips, which for the readers is the strip where Flash is escaping from the bellows, the underground cave prison, and Bach, Flash is reaching down, for Bach to come with him, and Bach's the Dragon Man, sorry, and Bach is like, no, I don't belong up there, I belong down here, and Flash goes, is that you talking or Ming? And then Bach takes his hand, pulls him out. So I've seen that. Mom has that, but I haven't seen a single strip in real life.
Amazing. All right. So the questions.
All right.
So let me do the first one, Steve, and then I'll give it over to you.
You got it.
All right. So cartoonist Jack, what up, Jack? It says, Dan, what does your daily schedule and routine look like making Flash?
Well, it's more of a weekly schedule than a daily schedule, and by that I mean I'm not sitting down for 8 hours every day. It's more of a bullwhip situation where, say I've just turned in my strips the day before. I'll usually spend that day recuperating, and we'll come back to why. Then the next day is spent scripting that week's daily episodes and then next week's Sunday episodes. That usually takes about 2-3 days. I'm doing a lot of like writing stuff on note cards, moving things around, doing preliminary sketches. And now I'm doing designs to pass on to Emmett Graham, who's assisting me on this Phrygian arc, because he has to know what the costumes look like. Then I do layouts of the daily strips and pass those over to Emmett. While he's working on that, I start drawing the next Sunday strip. And it usually takes about 2 days because there's a lot of bespoke designs that go into that. I have to design new locations, new costumes, new characters, and really like new stuff for every of the 6 or 7 panels of that Sunday strip. By the time I'm done with that, ideally, I've got the more fleshed out pencils from Emmett. By the way, when I say ideally, Emmett is a machine who turns in everything right away on time every time. When I say ideally, I mean ideally I'm done with the Sunday in enough time to start doing the dailies. I then spend the next day fleshing out Emmett's pencils, refining some angles, refining the faces. Now we're getting into like 8-hour days. And then the last 2 days are usually like 30-hour days, getting everything inked, lettered, colored, and then I spend the next day after that, after everything's turned in, assuming everything goes well, assuming I've completed that weekly effort that is supported by an incredibly understanding, supportive romantic partner situation, I then recuperate and start on the next thing.
So your days get longer as you go through your week.
Yes, definitely. And some of that's self-fulfilling because earlier in the week, that's when I do my socializing. That's when like going on dates, seeing people, seeing movies, that's when that happens. But also that's part of recovering. If you're not, if you're not living your life, the work isn't going to get better. Because like cool stuff that happens to be in my daily life goes into the comic. Like I wouldn't be so good at drawing Flash getting beat up, which I like to think I'm good at it. I wouldn't be so good at that if like I hadn't gotten beat up sometimes. Like I meet different people out at events, out in bars. I see, I get to watch weird musical acts and see art shows. Like all of that makes the comic better. So I like to think that there's an all parts of the buffalo approach where the time that's wasted earlier in the week isn't ultimately wasted in the scope of the work.
Very cool.
I love that language. It's like, as a cartoonist, when you're not producing the cartoon, you're wasting it. It's like, no, that's the work-life balance.
Oh yeah, toxic capitalism brain. Let me tell you.
All right, we got some other questions here, mostly from the YouTubes. We start with two of these overlaps. I want to give them both a little bit of screen time.
Okay.
Aaron Menser on YouTube asks, question for Dan, is there anything you're planning aside from continuing with Flash Gordon? Any creator-owned stuff in the works? A big fan of Lavender Jack.
Thank you very much for that. I really appreciate that. I have one big original series that I'm slowly working on the pitch for. I have a lot of sketches and story documents. I think it's really good. It's a supernatural mystery series that is it's very similar to Lavender Jack, only instead of happening in the early 20th century, it happens in like Game of Thrones times. It's very like it's Merlin meets Guy Ritchie. Oh, I guess he actually did a King Arthur movie, didn't he? Well, it's like that.
He did. What are you planning? I mean, now thinking about Flash Gordon as a thing which you will do in perpetuity the end of time. How do you plan for other things, other projects?
Well, I've learned from the delays that Brennan in my Dark Horse series, St. John, has suffered, that I can't draw anything else right now. I can't draw anything outside of Flash Gordon. So I have other projects I want to do that are all writing based. And either those will get off the ground or they won't. But I know now enough that I'm not doing myself any favors by trying to overpromise what I can produce.
That's great. This ties in, kind of dovetails with the last question, but you teased and entertained things in the past. This is Mr. Patrick Bramble on YouTube. You've teased and entertained things in the past. So I wanted to ask if you'd ever return to some of the older creator-owned characters or venture back into that avenue in the future.
I have a. I'm almost reticent to say this because I kind of don't want to get asked about it a lot, but I have an outline for a new Lavender Jack graphic novel that I'd really like to do at some point. It would be traditional comic, OGN. So I love those characters. I've had a break from them. Ending the series was surprisingly emotional. I never had to end something that long that I owned, that I did. So there is another Lavender Jack thing that I am working on, but bear in mind, that's not like an anytime soon situation. So
were those Lavender Jack webtoons collected in any way in print? Or were they adaptable?
That it's had a tumultuous experience trying to get into print. Hopefully, maybe someday. But this would be a book that could be read fresh, that could that follows up on the series in a way that kind of breaks new ground, but has all the same characters and same vibes as what the original one had. So yeah, hopefully this thing ends up happening, because I'd really love to do it.
That's great. Dennis Ryan on YouTube. Question, Dan. Did you have any advanced knowledge of the Irish translation of your Flash Gordon run? I assume that's a marketing element, but was curious if you'd heard it was reaching new audiences.
I didn't have very much advanced knowledge of it in terms of, early planning stages. But before it was announced, Gary Maloney, the translator, did reach out to me, who, by the way, is a really great guy, talented artist. His book, When the Blood Has Dried, is out right now through Mad Cave, which I understand is really good. And I understand it because I read it. So he gave me a little bit of a head up. He told me what the Irish language version of Ming the Merciless was going to be. Like, apparently he had to dig into some more mythological areas of the language to find a version of the word merciless that started with an M. Anyway, so I knew a little bit about it beforehand, but it's not like I was consulted. I was more informed that it was happening. I'm really excited, by the way, by it. I love that it's in a different language. I love that it's this specific audience that isn't necessarily catered to in American comics very, very often. I'm glad that they're able to experience this, and I hope they like it.
That's great. And the last one we've got here in the lightning round, Dennis Ryan, in the Animator Survival Kit, Richard Williams recounts asking Milt Kahl, I'm stumbling over everything, Milt Kahl, if he listened to music while working. He did not. Do you agree? If not, what do you listen to?
In an issue of Mark Waid's Fantastic Four, drawn by Mike Marengo, we learn that one of the ways in which Reed Richards writes or does math is he'll stand in the middle of Times Square, made invisible by Sue Storm, and he'll just stand there. Nobody knows he's there. No one, he's standing up on a thing, so no one's bumping into him, because he finds the supreme overstimulation of being in Times Square a soothing space to inhabit that enables him to think more abstractly and creatively. And that's how I feel. I always have media going on, sometimes two at the same time, not because I'm being distracted by it, but because there's something about that blanket of information, of stimuli that frees up your mind. It's sort of like how you relax when you think the camera's not on you. I feel like that's what happens with my brain, and enables me to make decisions that I might overthink otherwise.
And you can write in that environment?
Oh yeah, I write in bars. I write during movies, and by the way, this is a very relatable comic strip artist thing, a comic strip writer thing, I assume, which is you're walking to and from the grocery store and dictating into your phone a script, just wherever you're on the elevators, wherever you can, just getting little bits of it in, because there is a mountain of writing material you have to generate, especially because Freudian slip, Flash Gordon is a lot denser than some comics. And so the writing of it is, not only are there more words, but also you're really working on reducing word count to try and make it still an attractive comic strip. So a lot goes into writing Flash Gordon. And if I couldn't do that while watching movies or listening to music, I would never watch movies or listen to music.
Well, that's fantastic.
Yeah, I think Roy Crane talked about that, about writing for comics and Mark Twain also said that a lot of writing is rewriting, and so Crane would write stuff, and then can I rewrite that and get 2 words less? You know what I mean? Can I? Because you're always fighting the real estate.
Yeah, that's so true. It's funny. one of my favorite recent movies is Hail Caesar, which has this iconic scene in it where Aiden Eidelreich, probably didn't say that name right, plays a young, handsome cowboy actor who the Hollywood studios have made be in like a stuffy Downton Abbey style drama, directed by Ray Fiennes. And he's supposed to say this line, would that it twere so simple. And this scene is Ray Fiennes and poor Alden just like going back and forth over and over with Ray Fiennes trying to get this goofy country ass kid to say would that it twere so simple, as he keeps just like garbling it. And then finally we see the actual scene, the final scene they shot and cut, where he goes, it's complicated. And that's what rewriting these strips is like. Like you have this big thing you're trying to say, this big chunk, and you have to really get zen about it and be like, what's the information that we're trying to convey here? And we want to do it with style, but we want to do it.
Beautiful.
All right, guys, we're going to start wrapping up. Dan, you're a fantastic guest. We're not done yet. We're going to start dropping the landing gear now. So, Mike, any last words?
Well, I just want to thank you for coming on, and congratulations. And I think you're doing a great job on. And it's always risky. It's always risky to do a classic character, because you're gonna I learned that from working on 2 classic scripts. You've got people, on the Phantom that, I mean, I was aware of the Phantom, but I was not super aware of the Phantom. And then you become aware of like all of these people that are like amazing fans. They know the character, they know every story, they know everything in and out. So I'm assuming that with Flash Gordon, you're going to get some of the same thing. You're going to get people that have been loving these characters. Like my dad has just turned 91. He read the Phantom as a kid, and he was more excited about me doing that than anything else I've ever done in my career. And I know that there are people that feel the same way about all these classic characters. So
yeah, they got real fans, and fans that love it. Like really, it means a lot to them. They really love it. And there were some that, that's the one. Being Mithroker, I shouldn't have tried. Every white American dude needs to know when not to try. So and when I first came on, there were definitely people who weren't sure about me, and not all of them said it terribly politely. But as the series has gone on, and I know the same thing must have happened with the Phantom, where people see that you love the same thing that they do, that you're invested in making it. You're not just trying to make it your own. You're trying to make it good for them, for you. That you're trying to make a product that stands up. My big something in my pitch in terms of like what's my goal for this. It's I want to do the comic clean and nice and classic, but dynamic and exciting and accessible, and have that produced in such a way that every single day somebody is getting this exciting little fun-sized thing that they can connect to and follow and enjoy. Right. And people, like, if you keep doing it long enough, people see that you're coming at it from the same direction that they are, and they'll stop seeing a threat and start seeing variety.
I love that.
Yeah.
Steve, you have any last words for this session?
Just love that a lot of that Flash came from you writing that kind of letter about Rip Kirby and self-love. Yeah. Just love that kind of, just the chutzpah, the kind of nerve. I don't know what you call it, but it's such an important ingredient to making some of these opportunities happen. So it's lovely.
It's true. You have to be willing to, I don't know. The worst thing she can say is no, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Shoot your shot.
Yeah, it's lovely.
Dan, you're a fantastic guest. I just put your info on the screen for where people can follow you on their internets. But is there anything that we're missing? Anything? Any other place you want to shout out before we get out of here?
Well, I'm happy to say that my website, danschkade.com, is kind of the one-stop shop. It's got on the front page, there's these 4 big buttons that take you to Flash Gordon, Lavender Jack, St. John, and Spirit. On that same website, I've got some original, just fun gag comics you can look at. There's like kind of a guide for how to read Flash Gordon on it. And then I post on Twitter all the time. I'm very funny. And my Instagram has a nice repository of all my just like little sketches, funny, internet stuff. And but in terms of following like what I'm doing, it's Flash Gordon. Check in your newspapers or on Comics Kingdom or on USA Today, Washington Post, their individual comic book sections. Oh, thank you so much. Because that Flash Gordon is where I'm putting my back into that. And I'm hoping that by the end of this run we'll build something that stands with the other amazing people who have handled the strip before me.
Fantastic.
Great.
Awesome, guys. We're going to do the wrap up. Thank you so much, Dan. Don't disappear. We have to do business on our way out. Guys, thank you so much for joining us live. We do this every Wednesday at 8 p.m. EST. If you came in on the slipstream, is what I like to say when people watch the show because of the guest. Didn't you love this? I mean, come on. I think it would behoove you to stick around because we do this every week. This is must-see interneting, Steve Conley. You can't get this anywhere else.
I believe you.
Well, you should. Good. So, well, guys, we're going to get out of here. We're going to let Dan pee. But before we go, I want to put out some shouts for upcoming pencil-to-pencil programming. Next week, 5/8, we have Gamal Hennessy, writer and commercial contract attorney. So we're living in a very interesting world, us freelancers and cartoonists. He just finished a really successful Kickstarter where he's been writing books, kind of like business books on contract law for freelancers and illustrators and cartoonists. His last book that just came out is called The Business of Freelance Comic Book Publishing. If you have questions about contracts and law and how not to get sued, you better not miss next week.
Or how to sue.
Oh, yeah. Also that. Yeah, how to protect your IP. All those things are really important. Protect your IP out in these streets.
Not wrong.
Also, I would be remiss if I didn't tell you that right here on this Bat Channel, 9 p.m. tomorrow night, Coffee Break with JN. You get to hang out with me and watch me drink a cup of coffee and run my mouth. You don't want to miss that. All right, guys. Thanks a lot. We have one more thing to do. Guys, we're almost at the end times. I just heard about so we have encroaching mutant cicadas that are coming this way. We just got past the lantern flies, but if we can survive for another 5 years, I think it will be imperative that we come on, Dad, get it ready, wash those Kirby hands, and run for shelter. Guys, thanks so much. We'll see you next week. Be good.
Thanks, Dan.
Thanks for having me.
Good night.
Night.